Under a pale October sky, the Ozark hills rolled in soft, endless waves, the forests wearing their patchwork of gold and rust. To most people, this stretch of wilderness was a sanctuary: deep rivers, limestone bluffs, deer slipping through the undergrowth. But for those who knew the land the way Gideon Marr did, it was something more, a test of endurance. A place where man could live by wits alone. Gideon had been a survivalist for most of his 41 years. Not the performative type with YouTube channels and sponsorships. Gideon had learned his craft in the quiet, hard way. His father, who'd worked the sawmill until a busted knee ended his livelihood, had taught him how to snare a rabbit, tan its hide, and cook it over a smokeless fire. His mother, who had grown up in a self-sufficient commune outside Jasper, taught him foraging what leaves to chew to dull pain, which berries could kill a man before sundown. For the last decade, Gideon had lived in a rough-built cabin on 22 acres of inherited land, half an hour's hike from the nearest county road. He came into town only once a month for salt, coffee, ammunition, and the odd replacement tool. People in Marble Falls knew him as quiet, polite, but with that air of someone who didn't much belong to the modern world. It was a cold morning in November, 3 years ago, when he was last seen. A hunter named Chuck Dorman swore he'd spotted Gideon along the trail to Devil's Backbone, carrying a canvas pack and a long stick that might have been a walking staff or a makeshift spear. They'd exchanged nods. That was it. Gideon didn't come into town that month, or the next. By January, his absence had become a topic of murmured speculation at the diner. When Sheriff Wayne Carter finally went out to check on him, the cabin was empty. Not ransacked, just paused. A tin mug on the table, the remnants of a meal still in the pan. His bow leaned against the wall. His pack was gone. His rifle, too. Outside, fresh snow had already erased whatever tracks he might have. Left search parties combed the woods for days. Volunteers with dogs, drones, even a retired park ranger who claimed he could track a squirrel in a windstorm. But the forest kept its silence. By spring, people stopped looking. The official file listed Gideon Marr as missing, presumed deceased. And then came the turtle. It was late summer, 3 years later, when 12-year-old Micah Jennings found it down by Crooked Creek. He and his sister had been turning over rocks in search of crayfish when a large, weathered snapping turtle came lurching. Out of the shallows, its shell was mottled, streaked with algae unmarked. At first, Micah thought the pale lines on its back were just scars. Then he noticed they formed numbers, crude but deliberate. 6 digits, spaced in 2 sets of 3, like coordinates. His father, a postal worker with a sideline in geocaching, recognized the format instantly. "Somebody carved these," he said, frowning. "A long time ago, maybe, but why?" When the sheriff's office plugged the numbers into a GPS, it got a location deep in the forest, nearly 10 miles from the nearest road. Within a week, Wayne Carter found himself leading a 4-person team toward that spot. Long for the Trek was a state police detective, a wildlife biologist curious about the turtle. And Gideon's cousin Ruth, who'd never stopped believing he was alive, or at least that the forest still held his truth. The trail was rough, the heat oppressive. But when they finally reached the coordinates, the trees opened to reveal a small, grassy clearing bordered by jagged rocks. And in the center, half hidden under tangled brush, was the entrance to a narrow cave. The air that poured out was cool and damp, smelling faintly of smoke and something else, something older. Ruth stepped forward, heart pounding. She didn't know it yet, but whatever was inside that cave would unravel everything the town thought it knew about Gideon Marr. The Ozarks themselves? The Ozarks in early September carried a strange kind of stillness. The morning fog hung low between the trees like ghostly rivers winding through an endless sea of green. Rachel Knox followed the narrow deer path with her boots crunching on. Brittle leaves, the sound almost deafening in the quiet. Somewhere ahead, beyond the tangle of thorn and oak, was the glade where she'd last seen the turtle. It wasn't any ordinary turtle, not after what she'd seen. She'd been helping. Her uncle fixed the wire fencing near the stream. When the creature ambled up from the water's edge, its shell caked in mud. At first, it seemed unremarkable. Then, As the muck dried and flaked away under the sun, she'd seen them faint, deliberate etchings, like someone had taken a fine blade and carved numbers into the shell. Coordinates. She hadn't told her uncle yet. Rachel wasn't sure why she kept it to herself. Maybe it was because Uncle Dean had a way of turning even small discoveries into complicated business, involving half the county in a matter of hours. Or maybe it was because she knew what those numbers might mean. 3 years ago, her father, Daniel Knox, had vanished somewhere in these same woods. He wasn't a man prone to accidents. Daniel was a survivalist, a tracker, a man who could identify the species of bird from a single note and tell the time by the angle of the sun through the canopy. He'd been leading a solo trek into a remote section of the Ozarks to document water sources and test old navigation equipment. He'd radioed in his position the first 2 days, but on the third, the signal stopped. Search teams found no sign of him, not a pack strap, not a footprint, and now, coordinates on a turtle shell. She pulled the small leather notebook from her jacket pocket and flipped it open. The numbers were scrawled exactly as she'd copied them that day: 36.45 feet 52 inches in, 92.23 feet 15 inches W. She'd looked them up on an old topographic map in the house. The point landed in a steep, rarely traveled ravine about 15 miles from where her father's last transmission had been traced. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and something else metallic, almost like blood. Rachel stopped, scanning the brush. The sound of rushing water came from her left, and she adjusted course. Pushing past saplings until the trees opened onto the stream, she crouched by the bank, eyes sweeping the current. And there, on a sunlit rock in the middle of the water, was the turtle. Same dark patterned shell. Same faint lines. She waded in without thinking, the cold biting through her jeans. But as she got closer, she realized something strange. The turtle wasn't alone. Around it, half submerged in the shallows, lay a small waterproof pouch. Tangled in roots, she pried it free and stumbled back to shore. Inside was a folded, weather-stained map, and across it, in bold black marker, was her father's handwriting. It read, "If you're reading this, don't follow alone." The night in the Ozarks had a way of swallowing sound. Even the crickets seemed cautious, chirping in hesitant bursts, as though wary of what might answer back. By the time Deputy Mara Klein reached the creek bed, the only sound was the trickle of water and the rasp of her own breathing. She'd followed the coordinates from the turtle's shell for over 4 hours now, deeper into the backcountry than she'd ever gone alone. Her radio had lost signal 20 minutes ago. She stopped and took in her surroundings. To her right, the creek curved in an almost perfect horseshoe before disappearing into a narrow canyon. Massive boulders jutted out of the water like the spines of some submerged creature, slick with moss and glistening in the pale light of her headlamp. To her left, the forest rose sharply, its steep slope tangled with roots and low-hanging branches. This was the kind of terrain that could hide something for decades, or swallow a person whole without a trace. She crouched near the water's edge, shone her light on a flat rock, and pulled the folded scrap of paper from her jacket pocket. The coordinates had been etched crudely on the turtle's shell, then transcribed by the team earlier that morning. She'd checked and rechecked them against her GPS before setting out. Now she was here. But here wasn't telling her much until she noticed the second mark. It was small, barely visible beneath a thin layer of algae. A single line, then a curve, almost like the beginning of a spiral. Mara knelt, scraped it clean with the edge of her knife, and felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't natural erosion. Someone had carved it. The lines formed a crude symbol, a circle with a triangle inside, and at the triangle's base 3 short vertical lines. She'd seen this before, not in any official report, but on the leather-bound journal found among the Survivalist's abandoned gear 3 years ago. It had been dismissed as some personal doodle or insignia. But here it was again, carved into stone in the middle of nowhere. Her breath fogged in the cold air. This wasn't a random mark. It was a signpost, and she suspected it was telling her to go into the canyon. The creek narrowed, forcing her to step into the freezing water to proceed. Within minutes, the canyon walls rose on either side, hemming her in. The moonlight barely reached here. Her headlamp was the only thing keeping the darkness from pressing all the way in. The air grew damp. A faint echo followed her, the sound of her own steps bouncing back off the rock. Then she heard something that wasn't her. A splash, maybe 20 feet ahead. Mara froze. The sound came again, deliberate this time, like someone shifting their weight in shallow water. She flicked off her headlamp and let her eyes adjust. A faint glow, not from the moon, but something bluish and unnatural pulsed from around the next bend. She moved forward, each step careful. And when she rounded the curve, the sight stopped her cold. A man stood ankle-deep in the water, his back to her. His hair was long, tangled, and streaked with gray. His clothes looked like they'd been assembled from scraps, canvas, leather, strips of denim, and his hands were cupped around a battered tin lantern emitting that strange blue light. The glow reflected off the canyon walls, revealing dozens of similar carved symbols, each slightly different, covering the stone around him. Jasper Wren. Mara whispered before she could stop herself. The man turned. His face was gaunt, his eyes sharp but sunken, and for a moment, there was no recognition there, just the blank animal focus of someone who's been too long alone. Then, slowly, his expression shifted, and he smiled. "You found the first marker," he said. "His." The voice was rough, like gravel in a tin can. "But you're already too late. The Ozark wilderness has a way of making you doubt your senses. Out here, sounds carry strangely. Shadows move when they shouldn't. And even the most experienced outdoorsmen admit to moments where the forest feels almost watchful." It was this atmosphere that kept gnawing at Aaron's mind as he trudged through the undergrowth. The worn leather journal tucked inside his pack, the turtle, or rather, the carved etching on its shell had turned the entire case on its head. Coordinates, clear as day. Too precise to be random scratches. Whoever had etched them had known they would one day be found. And if Aaron was right, those numbers led to somewhere deep in the most inaccessible part of the Mark Twain National Forest, an area rarely visited, except by trappers, researchers, or those who didn't want to be found. The problem was, Aaron wasn't the only one who now knew. He first realized they were being followed on the second day into the trek. Lydia had been walking ahead, brushing a hand through the ferns when she froze mid-step. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Aaron stopped. Listened. The forest hummed with the usual chorus cicadas. The soft wind in the canopy, the distant creak of a tree swaying, but there was something else. A crunch of leaves. Deliberate, they waited. Nothing when they moved again. Aaron purposely shifted off the trail, cutting through a patch of thorny undergrowth. After 20 minutes, he dropped to one knee, pointing at the soil. Lydia leaned in. Fresh impressions, boot tread, wide. Heavy. I think someone's been behind us since yesterday?" Aaron said. The journal had belonged to a man named Elias Traeger, a survivalist with a reputation in certain backwoods circles. He'd vanished 3 years ago, under circumstances no one could quite explain. One day seen at a supply store in Eminence, Missouri, the next gone. His cabin had been found with the door open, supplies missing, and maps torn out of his atlas. Traeger had been skilled enough to live entirely off-grid, with caches of food, traps, and improvised shelters scattered through the Ozarks. People assumed he'd gone deeper into the wilderness and died, or perhaps didn't want to be found. But the coordinates scratched onto. That turtle's shell pointed to an area Traeger had once marked in faint pencil in an old topo map, an area he'd called the Hollow. By the evening of the third day, they reached a ridge overlooking a steep ravine. Below, a narrow creek cut through limestone, the water black in the fading light. "This is it," Aaron murmured, checking. The GPS were within a mile of the spot. That night they camped beneath an overhang of rock. The air smelled faintly of cedar and wet stone. Lydia had dozed off when Aaron heard it again, that faint crunch of leaves, distant but deliberate. He reached for the small revolver tucked under his jacket. "Who's out there?" His voice cut into the darkness. Nothing answered, but after a long pause, a single click echoed from the trees. The unmistakable sound of a camera shutter. The next morning they descended into the hollow. It was unlike any part of the forest Aaron had seen. Jagged cliffs on either side, the ground littered with bones of deer and smaller animals. The creek's water was so clear it reflected the cliffs like a mirror. Half a mile in, Lydia spotted something wedged into a crevice of stone, a rusted metal box, sealed with duct tape. They hauled it free and cut the tape with Aaron's knife. Inside were vacuum-sealed bags of food, a flare gun, and a waterproof envelope containing several photographs. The photos were old, but not ancient Polaroids of the hollow itself, but with strange structures in the background. One showed a crude wooden shelter beneath an overhanging cliff. Another showed something far more disturbing, a figure wearing a crude mask made of bark and antlers, standing waist-deep in the creek. Lydia's hands trembled as she flipped to the last photograph, Elias Tregear himself, looking directly into the camera, holding a piece of cardboard with one word scrawled in black marker, "Run by dusk." The presence behind them was no longer subtle. Whoever had been following was now within earshot, making no effort to hide. Aaron and Lydia quickened, their pace pushing deeper into the hollow until the GPS beeped. They had arrived. The coordinates led to the base of a sheer cliff, where an opening, barely visible from a distance, gaped like a mouth. Aaron stepped forward. Shining his flashlight inside, the beam caught something metallic, a small tin nailed to the wall with another folded note inside. Pulled it free. The paper was stiff from age and moisture. It read, "If you're reading this, it's already too late. Don't look for me. Don't stay after dark. They only come out when the sun leaves the ridge." Before Aaron could turn, Lydia's voice came sharp and urgent from behind him. "They're here." And from somewhere in the darkness of the hollow, a low, guttural whistle rose, not from any bird or animal, but from something that knew they were there. The cabin hadn't been used in years, at least not for anything ordinary. Rain had begun to drum steadily against the tin roof by the time I stepped inside, my flashlight beam catching the dust in the air like slow-moving snow.
Ow!
The boards beneath. My boots groaned, as if the whole structure had been holding its breath for the last decade and was finally letting it out. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not just must, metallic. The kind of smell that's stuck in the back of your throat. A single table sat in the center of the room. On it was a spread of items that should have rotted away long ago. A rusted camping stove, a cracked canteen, an old map of the Ozarks, corners curling upward. But it was the notebook that caught my eye. The cover was stained, the paper inside swollen from old damp. But the handwriting was still legible, sharp, deliberate, as though every word had been carved rather than written. The first page was dated August 14th, 2020, the day before Mason Laurel, the survivalist who'd been living off the grid for nearly a decade, was reported missing. Coordinates found. Keep hidden. Will retrieve at nightfall. Others watching. I read it 3 times before realizing my hands had gone clammy. I flipped through more pages. Entries were brief, almost coded. Creek's mouth blocked. 2 whistles. At dusk. North wall compromised. Then, halfway through the notebook, a sentence that made the hairs on my neck rise. If I don't come back, the turtle will know. I set the notebook down slowly. It's the turtle, the one found with the strange markings carved into its shell 3 years later, had been no accident. Mason had planned for it. Lightning flashed through the small, warped window, throwing a distorted shadow of my own body onto the far wall. That was when I noticed it. The boards near the stove didn't match the rest of the floor. They were newer, lighter in color, with nails that hadn't rusted like the others. I knelt, feeling for gaps. One of the boards shifted slightly under my weight. I used the back of my knife to pry it up. Beneath, wrapped in oilcloth, was a long metal tube, the kind surveyors use to protect documents from weather. My pulse thudded as I twisted the cap. Inside was a single rolled sheet, brittle with age. I uncurled it on the table, careful not to tear it. It was another map, not of the Ozarks as a whole, but of one very specific section. It's the same symbol repeated over several spots. A small, crude spiral, like a coiled snake or a shell. Someone had marked a route, not a straight path, but a looping one. Weaving through valleys and ridges as though deliberately avoiding something, I glanced at the notebook again. The last entry was dated the day Mason vanished. The first marker is under the old watchtower. After that, follow the sound of the water. Do not trust the clearing. My radio hissed on my belt, startling me. It was Carter, my partner, in this increasingly strange case. "You're not going to believe what we found by the creek," he said, his voice low. "It's another one. Another turtle." The rain was heavier now, and the trail back to the creek was slick. Carter was crouched near the waterline, his rain jacket plastered to his back. In his hands he held a turtle larger than the first one, its shell scarred with the same careful etching. But this one had something extra. Alongside the spiral was a number 2, and beneath it, coordinates. The first turtle had 1 carved above its spiral. "They're in sequence," Carter said, "like steps on a path." We both looked toward the dark wall of forest beyond the creek, where the rain was falling in silver sheets. Something told me that if we followed the sequence, we wouldn't just find where Mason had gone. We'd find who had been following him. That night, the map from the cabin lay on the table between us and the ranger station. We traced the coordinates from both turtles, realizing with a cold shiver that they aligned perfectly with the route marked in spirals on Mason's hidden map. 3 spirals on the map. 2 turtles so far, which meant there was a third, and if Mason's journal was to be believed, that third marker was the key, the one he never had the chance to reach. We left before dawn. Packs loaded, rain still clinging to the trees and beads. The Ozarks have a way of swallowing sound, and every step felt too loud. The first marker, the old watchtower, was nothing more than a skeletal frame of wood now, half collapsed, leaning into the wind. We found the remains of a fire pit nearby, the stones still blackened. No one had camped there in years, but something about the arrangement of the stones felt deliberate. We kept going, following the map's winding path until the faint roar of water began to thread through the air. The second marker came just before the creek widened into a pool. Carter spotted it first. The third turtle wedged under a log. Its shell was slick, the markings harder to see until we wiped it clean. A 3, a spiral, and coordinates. We both stared at the numbers. The location wasn't far, but it wasn't anywhere near a trail. We went anyway. The ground sloped upward, the forest growing darker. Then, just as the air grew still, we broke into a small clearing. Carter froze. "Wait." He whispered in Mason's journal. He had written, "Do not trust the clearing." At first it seemed empty. Then my eyes caught the shape at the far end. A small door set into the hillside, half hidden by vines. A makeshift handle, fashioned from bent metal, jutted out like an invitation. My mouth went dry. Whatever was inside had waited 3 years. And I had the sickening feeling it had been waiting for us. The forest had always felt ancient to Sheriff David Rourke, but that morning it felt like it was leaning in, listening. A thin mist hovered over the damp ground as he stepped away from the rusted trail marker, eyes scanning the hollow where the creek bent like an elbow. 3 years ago, they'd scoured this same spot looking for Caleb Hart, a man who could vanish in a blink even when he didn't mean to. Back then, there'd been no sign of him, not so much as a footprint. Now, there was something. It was wrapped in something almost absurd. A turtle shell, weathered and scarred, sitting half buried in the mud. On its surface, etched with something sharp and deliberate, were symbols, jagged lines, cross hatches, and coordinates that pointed to a place deep in the Mark Twain National Forest. Far beyond the regular hiking routes, Rourke crouched, brushing the shell clean with his thumb. He'd seen his share of strange clues in missing persons cases, half-burned notebooks, shredded maps, even messages carved into trees, but never a turtle. "Sheriff," Deputy Lang's voice cut through the fog, low but urgent. "You're gonna want to see this. Rourke followed him along the creek until they reached a shallow pool where something dark rested beneath the water. Lang reached in and lifted it out, a faded army-style backpack, dripping and coated in silt. Patches on it were unmistakable. Caleb Hart's. Inside were a few soggy survival manuals, a compass with the glass cracked, and a notebook wrapped in wax paper. Most of the pages were ruined, but one remained legible, the ink smeared but still clear enough to make out. If you find the turtle, follow, but don't come alone. The ridge isn't safe. Rourke closed the notebook slowly. He knew Caleb. The man had been an obsessive planner, meticulous about avoiding unnecessary risks. If Caleb said the ridge wasn't safe, it meant something more than steep cliffs or loose rock. The coordinates on the turtle shell were burned into his mind now. The coordinates on the turtle's shell had led the search team to a stretch of forest, so dense that even experienced trackers struggled to push through. The trees here were older, the canopy thicker, and the air seemed heavier, as though it had been untouched for centuries. When Sheriff Colburn's boots sank into the soft earth, he paused not because he was tired, but because something about the ground didn't feel right. It had a hollow give to it, the way soil feels over rotted wood or an old pit. He crouched, brushing aside moss, saw the faint outline of what looked like boards buried just beneath the topsoil. "Something's under here," he muttered. By late afternoon, they'd cleared enough debris to uncover what appeared to be a trapdoor. The wood was weathered and blackened, the metal hinges nearly rusted through. It took 3 men with crowbars to pry it open, releasing a burst of stale, damp air that smelled of mold and iron. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. The first few steps groaned under their weight, but they held. Colburn led the way, flashlight beam cutting through the dust. The passage was narrower than expected, the walls reinforced with old timber. Every few feet there were signs that someone had lived or, at least, hidden here. A battered enamel mug, a folded wool blanket, the remnants of a candle. But it wasn't until they reached the bottom that the air truly changed. The room they entered was larger than the space above had hinted, almost cavernous. A single lantern sat in the corner, its glass cracked but still intact. Along one wall, maps of the Ozarks were tacked up in layers, each covered in scrawled notes, strange symbols, and roots drawn in a shaky hand, and then they saw the table spread. Across it was a spiral-bound journal, open to a page that made everyone fall silent. The handwriting was erratic, desperate, and in the middle of the page, underlined 3 times, were the words, "The coordinates change. The turtle only shows them once." The morning after Mason's discovery of the turtle's shell, the Ozarks lay shrouded in a low, clinging mist. It moved like smoke through the trees, muting every sound except the distant drip of condensation from the canopy. He didn't sleep much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the rough etching again, those deliberate, almost obsessive scratches forming what seemed to be coordinates. The image wouldn't leave him, and neither would the uneasy thought that someone had placed them there for a reason that was never meant to be obvious. By the time he packed his gear and shouldered his bag, Mason had already decided he was going to find the spot those numbers led to. He didn't take the main trail. Instead, he moved parallel to it, keeping 2 narrow deer paths and dry creek beds where his boots left little trace. It was slow going. The undergrowth in this part of the Ozarks was thick, full of thorny brambles and low branches that clawed at his clothes, but Mason preferred the discomfort to the feeling of being watched, something he'd learned to trust after years in remote terrain. Hours into his hike, he paused on a ridge and pulled out his notebook. He'd transcribed the coordinates exactly as they appeared on the shell, double-checked them against his GPS. The point lay about 6 miles deeper into the wilderness, in an area where even hunters rarely ventured. Something about the location nagged at him. He couldn't place it until digging into the memory. He recalled the ranger's map from 3 years ago, the search area for Caleb Ryland, the survivalist who'd vanished. Those coordinates weren't far from one of the last spots Caleb's tracks had been seen. Before they abruptly ended, the first sign of trouble came around midday. He reached a low valley, where a narrow stream ran clear over smooth rocks, and found fresh footprints, not the rounded, aimless tracks of a hiker, but prints with a long, determined stride. The odd part wasn't that someone else was out here. It was that the prints were barefoot. The size suggested a man. But the weight distribution was strange, almost as if the walker was used to moving silently, toes gripping for balance. Mason followed them for a short while before they veered off sharply, disappearing into a tangle of brush. He stood there for a long moment, every sense alert, the silence around him pressing in like a physical weight. By late afternoon, the land began to change. The trees here grew older, their trunks thicker, bark dark with age, fallen leaves crunched underfoot, and patches of moss clung to stones the size of cars. It was here, near a collapsed section of limestone ridge, that Mason saw something wedged in the roots of a sycamore, a strip of faded fabric. It looked like it had once been part of a heavy shirt, dark green, worn thin, with one edge torn ragged. Mason crouched, brushing away dirt, and saw that the fabric was stiff with old dried mud. Something darker. Blood. The coordinates led him onward, until the GPS beeped softly, indicating he'd reached the exact spot. He looked around. Nothing stood out, just a depression in the forest floor, thick with leaf litter and surrounded by thorn bush. But when Mason pushed aside the brush, the ground felt hollow beneath his boots. He knelt, sweeping away the debris, until his fingers struck wood weathered, gray, and flat. Not a log. A plank. And then he saw it just under the soil, partially exposed by erosion, a crude wooden hatch. The metal ring on top was rusted but intact. Someone had buried something. Here, and whatever it was, it had been hidden for a very long time. The rain had stopped by morning, but the air felt heavy, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Mara woke with a dull ache in her shoulders, the kind that comes from too many nights on rough ground. The campfire was nothing but ash, and the strange turtlet's shell still etched with those crude, human-carved coordinates sat in a small mesh crate beside her pack. She'd taken it with her. Against all better judgment, the numbers were clear: 36.7532, 93.2704. She'd looked them up on her GPS unit the night before. The spot was deep in the western Ozarks, not near any trail she'd ever known. No towns, no cabins, nothing but a green void on the map. She broke camp quickly. It's no coffee, no fire, just water and a protein bar. The air smelled of wet leaves and clay, and each footstep squelched softly in the mud as she moved deeper into the forest. By noon, the coordinates led her into a place that felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, but off. The canopy grew so dense that sunlight barely touched the ground, and the undergrowth twisted in unnatural patterns, like plants that had been forced to grow around something unseen. That's when she saw it, half buried. In the moss and dirt was an old steel sign, the kind used for government property markers. The letters were faded, but she could still make them out. U.S. Forest Service Restricted Area, no ENTRW. Beyond it, a narrow game trail, wound between two ancient oaks. Something about the way the soil was disturbed made her pause. It wasn't the pattern of deer or hogs. This was heavier, deliberate. She followed it. The air cooled sharply, and the sound of the forest fell away until the only thing she heard was her own breath. Then the path opened into a small clearing, and in the center stood a collapsed shack. Its roof rotted through, its walls leaning at impossible angles. A tarp newer than the shack hung across the entrance. Mara froze. Someone had been here. Recently, she crouched, listening. Nothing. Just the faint creak of the tarp in the breeze. She stepped inside. The smell hit her first: mildew, rust, and something faintly metallic. The interior was dark, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw rows of shelves against the back wall. Not food, not tools, notebooks. Dozens of them, stacked in neat, deliberate piles. She reached for one, brushed the dust away, and opened it. The first page was dated August 14th, 2019, 3 months after the Survivalist. Caleb Rourke had supposedly vanished in the Ozarks. The handwriting was his. The rescue helicopter skimmed low over the dense canopy, its rotor wash-bending treetops as the rescue team peered out. Scanning for the small orange tarp Ethan had promised to unfurl if he was still alive. Below, the forest stretched like a green ocean, endless, unbroken, and dangerous. Then a voice on the headset shouted, "There, 9 o'clock." A flash of color in a small clearing, bright, unmistakable. The pilot dipped the craft lower. The crew prepared for the difficult extraction. When they finally landed and ran toward the tarp, Ethan Caldwell was there, gaunt, sunburned, and shaking, but alive. He clutched a weathered leather journal. Against his chest, as if it were part of him, "You found the turtle," was all he said, his voice hoarse. Inside the journal, the investigators later discovered detailed hand-drawn maps of hidden springs, food caches, and even crude shelters he had built during his survival ordeal. More importantly, there were coordinates ones he'd carved into the turtle's shell 3 years ago, hoping it might wander back to the riverside where someone would see it. He explained that he had stumbled on something deep in the Ozarks. A remote, decades-old moonshine operation turned into a smuggling route, still guarded by men who knew every hidden ridge. He had been captured, held in a primitive camp, and left for dead after escaping. The turtle, he said, was his only way of leaving a breadcrumb for the outside world. Authorities later found the camp exactly where Ethan's coordinates led. The remains of old stills and a crude bunker filled with stolen goods told a chilling story of a network that had operated in silence for years. Ethan never returned to the Ozarks after his rescue. He settled quietly in another state, changed his name, and avoided the press. But in the sheriff's office, the shell of that turtle, coordinates still faintly etched into it, sits in a glass case, a reminder that sometimes the wild keeps its secrets, sometimes it carries them. Back to you. The Ozark wind carried a strange stillness that morning, a silence so deep it made the forest feel almost staged, as if everything living was holding its breath. That was the day the final truth came to the surface, a truth hidden beneath. Years of lies, mistakes, and choices too terrible to undo. By now, searchers and investigators had moved far beyond the area where anyone once thought Ethan Granger might be. The turtle coordinates had led to an abandoned bluffside shelter. Carved from stone, hidden under roots so thick they resembled skeletal fingers gripping the earth. Inside, the air was cold, stale, and full of history. On a wooden shelf, they found Ethan's journal, wrapped in waxed cloth to keep out dampness. The handwriting was shakier than in his earlier notes, as if each letter cost him more strength than the last. He wrote about being followed in the forest, about finding traps, not animal traps, but human ones, hidden along old logging trails. He wrote about a group that used the deep woods as a base to move people and supplies in ways law enforcement never saw. He claimed he had stumbled too close to something they couldn't let him walk away from, and then, the most disturbing part, Ethan hadn't been entirely alone during his years missing. He had been kept, watched, used for his survival skills, by people who had no intention of letting him leave. He had survived, but at a cost so high it stripped away the man he used to be. In the final pages, Ethan confessed he'd left the turtle etching deliberately, not as a plea for help, but as a test. He wanted to see who would come. He wanted to know if anyone would still be looking after all that time. And he wrote one final line: "If you've found this, then you've found me, not the me I was." Last thing they discovered wasn't in the shelter at all. 50 yards away in a clearing was a shallow grave. Inside was a body. The remains matched Ethan's DNA, but the forensic timeline didn't match the day he'd gone missing. It suggested he'd been alive far longer than anyone believed, long enough to etch the turtle, right, long enough to write the journal, long enough to watch the woods close in on him like a mouth swallowing its last breath. The Ozarks keep their secrets well, but this one left a scar, not just on the land, but on everyone who stepped into that forest believing they'd find only answers. They found Ethan Granger, but they also found the truth he died with. Sometimes survival isn't about living, it's about enduring what no one else would.